All right, I know people would prefer to listen to this whole album, but I want to hear from Paola, and so does everyone else. So let's get rolling. JP, start us
Yes.
off.
Hello, everyone. Before I start us off, I want to hand it over to our interpreters for a quick message before we get started.
Hola, hola, yo soy Monse y estoy aquí con mi cointérprete Ada y vamos a proveer interpretación simultánea entre inglés y español. Hi, everybody, my name is Monse and I'm here with my co-interpreter Ada, and we will be providing simultaneous interpretation between English and Spanish. Para entrar en su canal de interpretación, ya deben de ver un botón en la parte inferior de su pantalla que dice Interpretación de idiomas. Ahí van a seleccionar y escoger español como su idioma preferido si ustedes prefieren participar y escuchar la llamada en español. Ya que es un espacio bilingüe, pueden compartir en español y contamos con la interpretación al otro idioma. Since this will be a bilingual space, we will have interpretation available. You can find the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can select English as your preferred language if you are an English speaker and want to listen and participate in this call in English. And you want to make sure that you select this option if you are not bilingual between English and Spanish. That way, you don't miss out on anything. Please remember to speak at a moderate pace since we are going to be interpreting live and we don't want to miss anything on the interpretation line. También recuerden hablar en un paso moderado, ya que estaremos interpretando en tiempo real y no queremos que nos falte ninguna cosa en la interpretación. Awesome. I'll give everyone a moment to turn on their interpretation and then I'll pass it back over to facilitators. Listo, les voy a dar un momentito para que enciendan su canal de interpretación y se lo pasamos a los presentadores.
Thank you so much. Okay, so everyone's situated. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Juan Pablo Alvarado, and I am the Spanish Climate Disinformation Program Coordinator here at GreenLatinos. And I'm super thrilled to welcome all of you out to today's event. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Really quickly, everyone, feel free to introduce yourself via the chat, who you are, where you're situated, what is it that you do. But yes, so I'll take a little moment, please. And as that's happening, I just want to say that our goal today is simple but powerful, and that is to educate, to inspire, and to mobilize our Latina community to tackle the intertwined environmental and social challenges that we're facing today. Together, we'll explore how disinformation impacts our fight for climate justice and how we can build collective strength to combat it. But before we begin, I'd like to share a few community guidelines to ensure a productive and respectful space for everyone. So for that, make sure to act with good intent and assume that others are doing the same, please. And use the chat to share comments, questions, or reactions, and we'll make sure to monitor and address any questions and during the Q&A section. And most importantly, let's approach today's conversation with an open mind, respect, and a shared commitment to progress, please. So to kick things off, it's my honor to introduce Mark Magaña, the founding president and CEO of GreenLatinos, a vibrant comunidad of Latina environmental and conservation leaders committed to fighting climate change and environmental injustices that disproportionately impact our communities. Mark's groundbreaking leadership stems from decades of experience, including being the first Latino to serve in senior roles at both the White House and in congressional leadership, where he championed critical policy initiatives. Mark's dedication to environmental and social justice has reshaped how we advocate for our communities and has been a true inspiration in my own personal journey as well. So thank you so much, Mark. And he'll now share opening remarks and introduce our special guest, Paola Ramos. Mark, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Juan Pablo, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for being here with us today. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the devastating wildfires in Los Angeles. I grew up in LA, and many of us know a lot of people that have been affected by it deeply. The immense toll they've taken in the lives and the livelihoods of those affected. Uh, let's take a moment to think about the impacted families, the first responders that are working tirelessly to protect these communities. Many of our members have lost their offices, their homes, and we want to make sure that we're doing all that we can to not just support them at this moment, but to continue our fight to be able to overcome the climate crisis and the surge of disinformation surrounding not just these events, but all of these emergencies that we see that seek to downplay the role of climate change and hinder effective solutions. So we at Green Latinos, we're rooted in uplifting and empowering the Latino, Latina, Latine community to win our environmental conservation and climate justice battles and secure our environmental liberation. As we confront the dual crisis of climate change and rampant disinformation, we see how deeply the issues intersect, undermining trust, dividing communities, and derailing efforts to protect our planet. Recent shifts in the electorate highlight both the power and the vulnerability of our communities in shaping the future. Disinformation targets our values, our identity, and our collective voice, especially in crucial moments like elections. That's why today's conversation is so vital, not only to understand these dynamics, but to arm ourselves with the tools and the solidarity needed to push back, build resilience, and drive meaningful action for climate justice. It's my privilege to introduce someone whose work has profoundly shaped our understanding of Latino identity, Latino, Latina, Latine, Latinx, however you want to say it, and its evolving political landscape. Paola Ramos is an Emmy Award-winning journalist and a distinguished contributor for Telemundo News and MSNBC, where she hosts the insightful program Field Report. Many of you may also know her from her impactful work as a correspondent for Vice News. Before her career in journalism, Paola played a pivotal role in politics. She served as the deputy director of Hispanic media for Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, was a political appointee during the Obama administration, and worked on President Obama's 2012 reelection campaign. Her unique blend of political and journalistic experience give her a rare perspective on the issues that matter most to our community. Paola is also the author of Finding Latinx, In Search of the Voices Redefining Latino Identity, a powerful book that sheds light on the diverse and dynamic voices shaping the future of our communities, as well as Defectors, which we will delve more into today. In addition to her storytelling, Paola is a former Hauser leader at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she earned her master's in public policy, and she now serves on the board of trustees for her alma mater, Barnard College. Born in Miami to Cuban and Mexican parents, raised in Madrid, and now based in Brooklyn, let's hear it for Brooklyn, Paola brings a truly global perspective to her work. Please join me in welcoming Paola Ramos. And I want this to be a real welcome. So let's turn our cameras on. Let's hit those emojis. Throw out a grito. Let's get weird for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mark. That's very no, thank you, Mark, and thank you to all of you truly for taking the time of during your day. Mostly thank you for all the work that you all are doing. I think obviously what's happening in California is yet another reminder of how important your work is, and sort of the solidarity and that you all have created. And so again, thank you. I'm excited to be here in conversation. I do not pretend at all to have answers to anything, and I think that's kind of part of the story, that it is an evolving story, and that there are so many answers and questions that remain unanswered, and I'm also super excited to learn from all of you, because I think part of the beauty of these conversations is that, particularly I think in the face of what we're all up against, I think a lot of collaboration will happen. And so I'm also just excited to be in this space with all of you. So thank you. And thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. Thank you to everyone, and also thank you, Monse and Ala, for all the interpretations.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'm excited about the rest of this hour. Paolo, we'll dig into the book, but we want to know more about you. This is the Latino community. We want to know how you're doing. And so number one, how have you been? You published your book September
That's
how's
right.
how's the last 3.5, 4 months been for you?
Well, I think like for many of us, crazy, you know? I mean, I think it's yes, like the book was published about a month and a half before the election. Um I think part of me wanted to be very wrong about sort of what I was seeing on the road, you know, the last couple of years. I wanted to sort of be pleasantly surprised when November 5th came, you know? Maybe I think what I was seeing on the ground the last couple of years was, you know, a Latino, Latinx, Hispanic community that was shifting and maybe signaling something different from what like Democrats wanted to hear, progressives wanted to hear. And then, of course, come to find out, you know, someone like Trump, in the midst of everything that he was saying, is able to get over 45% according to exit polls of that vote. And so the weeks after that election, as you can imagine, Mark, were crazy. And I think all of us are still trying to make sense of like what that means, how solid that is, and what work we can do. But just to give you an idea of like what the present looks like now, obviously we're like less than a week to go until January 20th. And so like even right now today, like I'm working on a story on the way that New York City and the sanctuary city is sort of rising to protect a lot of these migrant families and asylum seekers that are in the city that I think on the surface um, are supposed to feel protected. But I think now we're entering a stage of like, what is the strength of sanctuary cities now? And so that's one thing I'm working on. And then January 20th, in a couple of days, which also happens to be my birthday, I'll be in Miami with a lot of January Sixers that are about to celebrate because they believe they will be pardoned. And so, you know, that is kind of this new reality that we're stepping into. So that's how my week is going.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
We really appreciate you taking the time, and
No,
we're
of
we're glad
course.
we're glad you're at home, but taking the time to speak to this important group of environmental climate conservation advocates who are doing the work on the ground every day, and are reading your book and learning about what the next 4 years are gonna be like.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, all of our stories starts with our families, and you
Yeah.
dedicated your first book to your mom and your dad, and you
Yeah.
dedicated your second book to your abuelo Carlos.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear about, your background, your growing up, what made you who you are, and I'd love to hear more about your abuelo. I know he called you Pao, and that's my goddaughter's name, and I
Yeah.
love that name.
I'll tell you about my grandfather. Actually, I rarely discuss the reason why I dedicated the book to him. But my grandfather, you know, my father's Mexican, my mom is Cuban. My grandfather was Cuban exile, and sort of, you know, left the island in the 60s. And I think many of us can relate, no, to this idea of that nostalgia that like never really leaves you. I think his whole life was he was an incredible author. He wrote so many books, but his whole life was sort of dedicated to one day, you know, going back to Cuba. And so he really dedicated his whole life to that. I grew up with that. I grew up with then a father that's a journalist. My mom is a journalist, and so inevitably, even though reluctantly, I was like, I will not be doing that. I think I naturally fell in that field. But I think my grandpa's a good example of I think some of the dynamics in, let's say, even in Miami-Dade County, you know, he was I think you could say like a traditional like Republican in the Miami-Dade County sense. What made him Republican was this sort of like obsession with Cuba. Our politics were very different, but I think when Trump came in office, he knew where to draw the line. And also he was not socially conservative, and he was also someone that always sort of believed in people's like individual liberties, to the point that and again, I don't really share this publicly, but since you asked, like he had Parkinson's. And so in Spain, a lot euthanasia is something that we never talk about. No, euthanasia is legal there. And so he decided to that he wanted to go back to Spain, and that he wanted to die with dignity. And my grandfather, a year and a half ago, sort of embarked on a journey to sort of finalize that last wish that he had, to sort of die with dignity in Spain. And I think that speaks to kind of the person that he is, not that he always sort of, regardless of the politics, like truly fundamentally believed in people's right to live freely. And so I dedicated the book to him. I wrote the book as he was going through this process. And it made me very proud. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for trusting us with this story.
Yeah,
And
no, of course.
I, I could tell how much he meant to you. You opened
Yeah.
and you closed the book. You opened your first book with this anecdote with him. And
Hmm.
I really do understand, and we all understand the importance of family
Hmm.
and living in an intergenerational family and experiencing that is pretty amazing. Um, I think that lends to um, one of the three top frameworks you list in this book: tribalism, traditionalism, and trauma. Kind of the traditionalism falls
Hmm.
from our families. The trauma, falls a lot from our internalized intergenerational trauma that we carry. And the
Right.
tribalism tends to be, us looking for acceptance, us looking for a place where we can, be welcomed. And there's a lot of mention in this book of these three things. I'd love to hear about A, how you distilled into those three
Hmm.
headlines and how those have um, affected you and your journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think oftentimes as a journalist or as a reporter, you sort of have these deadlines, no? So you go in, you go to the field, you go to the border, and then you come back, you file the story, you go on air, and that's it. I think the beauty of having a little bit of time to write this book is that I was able to sort of look back, at all of these people that I was talking to. And I'm not just talking about like the extreme cases of this sort of like far right shift. I'm not just talking about those January 6th Latinos that I've met or sort of the Proud Boys. Um, but kind of paying attention to what I believe in the last 3 years has been this sort of very subtle rise of the way that we've sort of picked up on this anti-immigrant language in very subtle ways, or the way that like racism was anti-blackness was being sort of exposed and manifested. I'm talking to you all from Brooklyn, and even I spent so much time in the Bronx and in Queens, and sort of seeing from up close the way that some people felt more comfortable, no, speaking a version of their truths. And so I think once I was able to look at the whole map of folks that I had been interviewing for the last 4 years, I was able to sort of come up with these three buckets, no? Tribalism sort of helped me understand the role that like colorism and xenophobia and all of that like plays within our community. Traditionalism also helped me understand sort of the weight of colonialism, no? And understanding how all of that history has sort of shaped our moral compass. And more than anything, and I know we're all up against in our work, the way that then this sort of quote unquote culture wars was able to exploit in part of that, no? And then to your point, Mark, the trauma is, yeah, like it's understanding, particularly in my head, it was the way that maybe we had been conditioned to kind of have this weird appeal towards with authoritarianism, no? Which again is something that we don't really talk about, no? I think there's this idea that like strongman rule is something that we're all allergic to because of where we come from, but then there's a flip side of that, no? The way even that the US government through history sort of conditioned many Latin American countries to rely on strongmen, for instance, in the face of the threat of communism, no? So all this to say that I think everything is so messy politically, and once you understand that baggage that we carry, the history that we carry, the traumas that we carry, then you kind of start to understand that actually, yeah, like the Latinx Latino community is a very complicated one, and to understand that you kind of have to unpack all of these things, and that's the hard work, no? I think politically we don't really have a lot of time to do this and have these conversations during election seasons, because I think now we're in that moment, no, where we're sort of get to be like, what happened and why.
Absolutely. One of the things that was it's very compelling about your writing is that I tend to get a feeling of of who you were through the writing. And I'm pleased as
Mhm.
punch to be able to talk to you and you on video now. But every once in a while you do give us glimpses. And one
Mhm.
of the points that was really moving to me was the end of chapter 5. And you spoke about the resilience of Ruby and Luna. And then you kind of opened up a little bit at the very end and you broke the third wall of writing and said, so long as I could, I'd never tiptoe my way around love again. I'd always attempt to write my own story.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, how's that going? What were you trying to convey? And it seemed like you were almost in a confessional room. But I want to dig into that a little bit and just see how's that going.
Not confession. I think Juan Pablo and I were just talking about even like a place like the Rio Grande Valley, no? And I sometimes feel guilty because I feel like so much of my work, unfortunately, the last 2 years is like so doomsday, and I hate that sometimes. No, it's like it's and I sometimes I have control, sometimes I don't. No, but I think when you put sort of the fear and the anger and the resentment and the politics aside, like a place like the RGV, the Rio Grande Valley, is a place that I really always think about. No, yes, there's sort of the border politics and the humanitarian crisis, but the beauty to me of a place like the Valley is actually what people don't really talk about, right? Which is like underneath it all, I have found there like the most incredible organizers, right? The most beautiful queer scene, the bravest people that are able to sort of walk with pride in the middle of all these tensions. And I think that, that is kind of illuminating that every now and then is something that, that is also part of my job. And yes, and like for me as like a queer woman, which oftentimes I'm walking into, conversations that are pretty tense sometimes, and with people, whether it's some like Christian nationalists, pastors, or Proud Boys, or a Moms for Liberty, people that perhaps like fundamentally disavow of like who I am or who my friends are, or who I admire. It's hard, and so I think you need to just remain very grounded in sort of in the pride, no? In what makes you you. Yeah.
Do you think it's important for us to have conversations, meet with uh, people who are adamantly against us and who we are?
Look, that's up for debate. I don't think and I think that's like a good group discussion to have, right? I think one of the things that I am up against, for instance, in my sort of like NBC Telemundo world is how much airtime do you give folks like that? And that's a legitimate question, no? And I'm not here to sort of I understand the danger in doing that, no, and normalizing violent language and normalizing these guys. Like I get that. What I am obsessed with though is, and again, it's not for everybody, but I am obsessed with understanding what makes someone like crack. You know, what was the point of the shift? Because oftentimes, and I think I find this on the road, and I find, and again, not everybody, so I'm kind of overgeneralizing, but I think oftentimes you find that what makes people sort of go towards extremes is typically like a pretty painful journey. There's typically a sense of like insecurity, there's typically some loneliness in there, there's typically people that are kind of like searching for belonging. And I always bring up Enrique Tarrio, the former chairman of the Proud Boys, because with him I side so clearly. Like here is this like super macho like Proud Boys dude, that I think in Trumpism and in the Proud Boys he found something that he was lacking so much. um Enrique, this Black Latino guy in Miami-Dade County. And I mentioned that because I understood and I grew up in the very privileged Cuban American Miami bubble. And so Black Latinos like Enrique never fit in that bubble. Is I think I was through the years when I would see Enrique and I would talk to him, I kind of understood, the power that he felt, and when sort of he found something in Trumpism. And so I think that's sort of where I like to what I like to find. And but you bring up a really good point, Mark. Like I don't and we can talk about it later in Q&A. Like I'm not so sure what the cost benefit is. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that. Um, you have described yourself at times as an activist, and you went out and registered people ahead of the 2018 midterms. And in this, um, I think you have been very prescient when it comes to both the Defectors book, but even with Finding Latinx, you wrote. Um, Ahead of the 2018 midterms, you wrote, I know, and this was published in 2020, and you wrote that before then. I noticed a trend that may become the Democratic Party's worst nightmare. Young Latinos are increasingly registered as independent and nonpartisan. There are already signs of this trend as early as 2013. That year, Gallup did a study that found that more than 50% of Latinos younger than 30 initially identified as independent. Young Latinos were more likely to be independent than older Latinos. From what I witnessed during the 2018 midterms, that trend is solidifying today. Whereas our parents have historically represented a solid voting bloc for Democrats, young Latinos are unknowingly creating a new socio-political force that is subtly breaking schemes. Today, it is not enough for Democratic candidates to take the Latino vote for granted. And that seems to have also led into your Defectors book, where you dig more into
Yeah.
that.
Sorry, I'm
How
smiling because I just saw Diali on the chat, and Diali is someone that I admire so much. So hi.
fantastic.
Not to put you on the spot, girl. But
Tell me
yeah, I
more
mean,
about what you saw and how you really had that sense of to come that led you to this book.
look, I don't think I am not a genius. I think all it takes is for anybody that was and has been on the ground, and you all are there more than I am, to understand that things have been shifting. And I think there's two parts of this story, no? There's the positive and the more complicated one. The positive one is that it is a good thing to be more independent, perhaps, right? To demand more of a party and demand more of a system. It is and to ask more and to ask more than perhaps what your parents could do. That's a good thing, no? So I think sort of a distance, perhaps, of this alleged loyalty is a good thing. The flip side of that is that I kind of first started seeing this clearly even in the 2016 campaign when I was still sort of working in politics, because so much of the theory of the case of the Clinton campaign was that in the face of someone like Trump, in the face of everything that he was saying, the story was that, this voting group would show up in unprecedented numbers. And I remember that was such a big part of what our bosses would say. Even I remember like the morning of the election, like thinking of a place like Miami-Dade County, like that was in what we believed was going to be the story. And then of course, less than 50% of this voting group shows up. Fast forward to 2020, you see that after family separation, after everything that we witnessed at the border, after 4 years of Trump, still someone like Trump starts to make anywhere between 7 to 9 point gain with Latinx voters. And so I think at that point, I thought, particularly at a point where I was able to leave politics, and ask more serious questions and see things on my own. I think that was worth studying. No, what is driving this shift? And I think right now where I landed, and again it's evolving, is this question of, does this go beyond the Trump effect? No, was what we saw in 2024 a symptom of Trump, or, and again it's an open question, or is there something deeper? No, is this part of this sort of like cultural baggage and historic baggage that we carry? Did Trump, did he tap into something that is real, or is it simply again like a symptom of a larger shift? I have my theories, but I think the beauty of the moment we're in is that we get to talk about it and then work on that.
Yeah, and you had there was a quote in your book about Reagan back then saying
Yeah.
to a Latino audience, you are Republican, you just don't know it yet. And it's always been the case where they knew um, of there's like you call it, a traditionalism within our community, a conservationism socially, that might lead them to this. But why now? Or why does it seem like, forces behind this change, even new immigrants can be susceptible right now, it seems, to this language and this ideology. What are some of
Yeah.
the forces behind that?
I mean, there's so much there. But yeah, I mean, look, I think the Trump campaign and Republicans love that Reagan quote, right? And then you go even thinking about the Rio Grande Valley, right? Like so much of the campaigns there were like God, family, country, and sort of this belief that with those words they can mobilize, and shift the community. However, I think then in 2022, like post Roe, you actually see things that are very different. No? You see a Latino Latinx community that fundamentally supported reproductive justice and that voted in ways that I think not only surprised Democrats but surprised Republicans as well. And so I think it's once we get into sort of the traditional values, like it's a lot more nuanced, no? I think a couple of things are happening at the same time. One of them is I think Trump and his campaign understood, particularly in 2024, that anti-immigrant rhetoric could also work with some Latino voters. And I think that was new. And once they really understood that it wasn't just in Miami-Dade County or in the Rio Grande Valley, that they could go to the Bronx and hold a rally here, that they could do it in Phoenix, that they could do it in these places, they ran with that. And I think part of the thinking is that they saw a segment, not a majority, but a small and growing segment of Latinos that were becoming more assimilated and Americanized. And that they too could tap into a form of nativism and xenophobia. And at the end, again, it's not a surprise, right? There's nothing more powerful than anti-immigrant rhetoric, and no one's immune to that. No one is. So this belief that because we are who we are and the descendant of immigrants, this belief that we're immune to that is flawed. No, it's not true. It's contagious and it's powerful and it creates anger and resentment, and those are like universal feelings. Then I think what they did that worked across the board was running with this extremely violent, like anti-trans, transphobic rhetoric that I saw, I mean, everywhere I went. And that really worked really, really well. And I think that sort of merged a lot of their strategies now in this idea that trans people were, endangering your kids, that trans folks were here, that the government was spending money on them and not on you. This us versus them theme. I think in with trans folks, they were able to really criminalize them, and it also worked because as I often say, it invokes very powerful emotions that go beyond politics. It invokes fear, anger, and disgust. This sense of disgust against someone else, and that is very powerful. And then the last thing I'll say, again, I think across the board, I think unfortunately there was, particularly among a small group of men, as we saw, I think there was something very discomforting around the idea of a Black woman in power still. No? And I think what Trump was able to do really well is again tap into this feeling of, you are feeling insecure and for these reasons, no, and we're gonna give you back that power. And they also did that really well. So there's many ways to dissect this, and I think a lot of things are happening, and we're not even talking about the role of mis and disinformation, which at this point is the new norm. No, it sort of overshadows everything and has created this perfect storm that we're in.
Let's get into it. Um,
Yeah.
um,
And you guys see it all the time. I mean, in your work, it's everywhere. No.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're seeing, like, with Meta's recent announcement that,
Right.
it's unbelievable that they think this is the right time to be able to drop their fact checking, to be able to just let free speech run amok. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
it's interesting that some of the strengths that they found were based, like trans stuff, were based completely
Hmm.
on dis and misinformation.
Of
And
course.
like you said, and in the book, which I'd never heard this before, was that the disgust was the strongest emotion
Hmm.
that you can use, and they used it so vehemently. So, what tactics, have you seen and used to manipulate our communities, and why do you think they're so effective with our communities? There was a term that you used, perennial mourning, when it came to our susceptibility to misinformation. I'd love to hear more about what that perennial mourning means and where it comes from. And
Yeah.
then, you know, and I'll have a follow-up on misinformation, but tell me, a little bit more about
Well,
that. Why does it work so well on us?
well, I think it works well on everyone. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily think that we are more susceptible to it. But I do think that because of some of our um patterns on social media, no, we over-index on social media. We consume our news no longer. No, I mean no one's watching MSNBC and NBC, right? Like who literally like my grandmother watches me, like no, literally like no one else. And so we are consuming our news on YouTube and on Facebook. And so I just think naturally there's just a lot more entry points, to get us on Facebook, to get us on WhatsApp, to get us on like encrypted platforms. um and that of course has made our jobs like really really hard, right? Like when I am doing interviews, I'm talking to a country where over 50% of Americans like fundamentally believe that there's an invasion at the border, or right, or where a majority of Republicans never believed through these years that Joe Biden was a legitimate president. Over 50% of them believed in the great replacement theory. A quarter of them were justifying January 6th. And so, I say this because it's kind of what keeps me up at night, because it's kind of like we're living in these two very different realities, and that's very daunting to me, and I never have good answers to this question, because I don't know yet how to get out of those two realities. Um I think of course for our community, I mean, the examples of, the Democrats are communists, that works really well with the trauma, no? It manifests in people that are carrying real trauma, no? The sort of anger that they will are able to tap into, like those immigrants are getting more jobs than you, that us versus them, mis and disinformation, that works really well. But I think what's overshadowing the mis and disinformation is that I think it feeds into what I think is a very real disillusionment that I think a lot of people have in the community for right reasons, no? Some some for right reasons. No? I mean, even I think in Arizona, like some people that I would talk to that I think for many years have sort of been waiting for relief, no? And hearing promises, and wanting solutions on both parties. And I think mis and disinformation is able to feed that anger, no, and feed into that like resentment. And I think that's where it gets complicated, no, because then we're not just talking about mis and disinfo. We're talking about how that builds into the general distrust that people have of institutions and the Supreme Court and our leaders and the government. And I think that's the complicated part.
I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but I want to make sure that everyone knows we want to answer some of your questions. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom. If you'd go in there and pose your question, in about 5 minutes, we'll open up to some of those questions. I'm sure we're all excited to ask. Um, this is a hard question because I don't know the answer to it, and we've been working
Oh,
on this.
great.
We've been working on this for a while. But
Mhm.
have you seen any things that successfully counter mis and disinformation?
I think people like you. I think the yes, um I'll use Arizona because I was just talking about Arizona. I think every time I'm there, what gives me hope, for instance, is that I always leave understanding that the people that really have the community's ears are on the ground. No, they may not be looking at me. They may be on Facebook and they may be on WhatsApp, but the sort of the local radio stations, no, the Radio Campesinas of the world, the promotoras, the organizers on the ground, like I think there have been, over a decade of groundwork that is leading to a type of trust that I think is hard to break. And so, yes, while we're in this like, the midst of this mis and disinformation bubble, Like I do always want to remember that there are like community leaders and community members on the ground that know what they're doing and that know to talk to their community, mostly because we're talking about trust, no? It's who will, who will this person trust most, no? And when you look at the map, and we know who those community members are. And so it's just a matter of like that always gives me hope.
That makes a lot of sense, and I hope through our work, through Juan Pablo, through our comms team, that we are breaking through
Yeah,
um, this very powerful and organized disinformation and misinformation coming from all over the world, and hitting us directly.
exactly. Exactly.
That's I think it's gonna something that is vital to our efforts to overcome the climate crisis, because the disinformation that's running rampant in that area is so strong.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, we've historically and politically, we've always assumed that once people of color become the majority in 2045, that we got it made, that we're
Hmm.
going to be in control of policy and politics, and that dream, that concept that then we're going to be free, uh, is not coming to fruition, because I think it's not as automatic as we thought it was going to be.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
this doesn't automatically translate into progressive political gains. Um, I'm trying to talk and figure out about how do we learn some lessons and be able to, both in policy and communications and relations and organizing, as we seek to mobilize uh, future champions within our communities on our issues, and our issues of clean air, clean water, protecting land, protecting our communities, our health. Those are our traditional issues.
Hmm.
You know, are we not to not to waste, to reuse, to repurpose, to fit repair? That is our grandparents. That is our parents. That's who we are. We know
Hmm.
not to get where we eat. We know to be able to reuse, and we're taught those things. We are cultural conservationists. So
Right.
how do we bring back uh, our population to be able to know that it's our mission, it's our part of our heritage to be advocates for protecting vulnerable populations, to be able to turn these lessons into actionable strategies for organizations like GreenLatinos and our partners. We need to be able to do it now.
Look, I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that. But I think you just answered your own question, right? I'm sure, and I won't put you on the spot, but I'm sure if I asked you, what do you think went wrong with the last election? I'm sure you would have an answer, no? And if I were to ask you, did people listen to you? I'm sure you would have another answer. Or if I were to ask everyone on this chat, like, what do you think, no? Or how can we open up the system? How can sort of people at the core of power bring in new voices? You all are going to have really good answers around sort of the root causes of what went wrong and how we can do better. Um, and so I'm gonna leave that at that. But I think you're touching on, I think, what makes this moment we're in so uncomfortable. No, I think, at least for me, I would have imagined that in the year 2025, to your point, someone like Donald Trump, as he was promising mass deportations and flirting with authoritarianism and defying the rule of law, that someone like him, as we were sort of shifting, to your point, to a type of country that is supposed to look very different from where we are now, I would have never imagined that we would be having this conversation. Like, I honestly wouldn't have. And so I think that's kind of what makes all of this so almost surreal, regardless of your politics, no? But I think, as sort of, Democrats and progressives, as people are trying to find answers to what happened and how can we do better, I assume and I know that you all have way better answers to that than I do. What I know I have to do on my end is to be a better listener, I recognize sort of the media bubbles that I'm in that at times are completely unaware of the other conversations that are happening around me, you know? And so I know I have to be a better listener in that sense. And I know what I have to do now is sort of both hold people accountable and also continue to sort of humanize a lot of things, like moving forward and starting the next week. Um, I know I probably have to do a way better job at saying, like, understanding that all the stories and all the work that you guys are doing is fed into these sort of media ecosystems as well. Because I think I don't have a good answer to that question, Mark, but I'm sure you do. You do.
Uh, Fortunately, I'm not the you're not the reporter today, so I don't have to
I
answer
know,
it.
right? I know. I'm like, let me bring it back to you. No.
A
Yeah.
question, my last question before we got some good Q&A questions coming up.
Yeah.
My last question is for you, as I've been asking a lot of people that I know is what, and I need to hear this. What's giving you hope?
Wakes me up. What gives me hope? Um, what gives me hope, okay, so even yesterday I was talking to someone from United Farm Workers in the Central Valley, and we were talking about the raid that happened there last weekend, I believe. And he was obviously we were talking about people that were detained and are already in Mexico. But one of the things that he mentioned was how incredible it was to see people on the streets. You know, and I think one of the things that the raids in the Central Valley did is because CBP was in public spaces. They weren't going into houses, but they were in public spaces. I think the message that sent to the community was stay in your house, no, don't leave. And so one of the things that this organizer was telling me was the way in which people, of course, are already afraid because CBP feels emboldened to go to those neighborhoods. But then what he said was that he was already seeing that it felt good to see people like on the streets, not backing down, kind of like not going back into the quote unquote like shadows, no. And I think it's that second, third generation of Latinx folks that will fight, and so that gave me hope for a second. Yeah.
I love it. You just gave me hope. I love it. Thank you. Uh, let's do some rapid fire questions. This is the rapid fire section of our Encuentro. So, JP.
Yes, of course. And thank you so much, Paola. It's been so insightful. But really quickly, before we get into the rapid fire questions, I do want to prompt us to all come on camera so that we can take a quick picture, in spirit of Bad Bunny's new album, Debí tirar más fotos. That way we can remember this
Mhm.
moment, especially with Paola. It's a special moment. So please. And I'll hand it over to Cumbia or Eder.
Hey everyone, just gonna take a screenshot of all of us together here. 1, 2, 3. Beautiful, thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much, everyone. Okay, so for the sake of time, we will not be able to get to all the questions, but I will do my best to ask as many as I can and see how we get along. So, first one coming in from Rebecca Paola. She's asking,
Yeah.
based off your research and analysis, how much does social class factor in political views and perceptions?
um I mean, I think that's, of course, I think that's part of it, but I think what to me was a little bit surprising is that even like newly arrived immigrants in Florida were sort of picking up a lot of this like anti-immigrant language, very similar to the privileged sort of Cuban community in South Florida. And so I think that, like, I think the at the beginning, like, I think there definitely was like a division of classes, right? Like I could see like the bubbles and like the Miamis and the Californias and the New York sort of acting according to that like social class differences. But I feel like what I've been seeing is that people are like defying that, no? The language and the sort of transphobic language, the culture wars, like all of that was like bringing in people from very different ethnic backgrounds, social classes, immigrant status, um, And so that to me was not surprising, but something that I noticed that, I think, and I think that's kind of part of the story, no? These patterns cut through all of that, no? The anti-immigrant sentiment, like again, like no one's immune to that. The like evangelical extremism that some people hear, a lot of people are in those spaces. No, it's not just from one social class. And so I think that to me has been interesting, the way that all of this is like cutting through class and race and ethnicity.
Yes, of course. And that actually is a good segue to a second question coming from Sean. Do you think our strong religious ties in our communities are why Trumpism and the right is able to attract so many voters?
Not I think the evangelical piece has been interesting. Again, not the majority of evangelicals. I think one of the oftentimes the first question I have for people that are coming to this country for the first time is, what's the first thing you do? Finding community in churches, not feeling at home, getting into those safe spaces is many times the first places that people go to. And I think these, and I saw it obviously a lot in the Rio Grande Valley. I've seen it in California. I've seen it here, even here in New York. I think these traditionally safe spaces, a lot of evangelical churches, for instance, in the last couple of years have become extremely politicized. And I think Trumpism has been able to understand the power that lies in those walls, no? To understand that Latinos are the fastest growing number of evangelicals, to understand that so many people that are migrating from, Guatemala, El Salvador, like these are countries where over 40% of the population in Guatemala is evangelical. And so I think they understand that there's an opportunity to like politicize those spaces. It starts with a powerful pastor, and it can go all the way down to people that are campaigning in the proximity of those spaces. But I think for sure they see an opening there for sure.
No, thank you. Thank you. And so another question coming from Jennifer that I think is really interesting is she flags that there's a strong pro-choice and pro-environmental movements in Latino America. We've seen it in Mexico, for example. Do you think these are being ignored by our community in the US? And if so, in what way and why?
A strong pro-choice.
Yeah, pro-choice and pro-environment movements in Latino America.
No, there is. I mean, and I think that's what I mean. Look, at the end of the day, Trump didn't win the Latino vote, right? Like, I mean, he didn't, right? And so I think the majority of the community is pro-choice, is pro the environment. I mean, that's the majority of people that we're talking about. I think you're right. I mean, I think to me, like seeing the uprising in Mexico, like the reproductive justice movement, like through Latin America, has been inspiring, has been incredible. And so I think one of the lessons learned, I think of for many election cycles was that yes, this is a community that believes in reproductive justice, that believes in climate change, that believes in these things, and that is the majority of the story. So I definitely don't want to sort of take away with that. No, I think when I talk about defectors, it's we're still talking about like a small but growing segment of the community. That has been sort of bombarded with dis and misinformation, but I think the reality is what you just said.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Last question for the sake of time comes from Sara. She says, Paola, what problematic behaviors do you think are continuing to hold our community back and even oppress each other? What are ways that we can better treat and behave with each other? And how can this be connected to the values we hold or aspire to hold?
Problematic behaviors. I mean, I think I don't
Yeah.
know. There's a bunch. Um, uh, um, I mean, look. I mean, I'll give just a very even just like a personal one on and within my work bubble. No, it's even understanding the way that some networks are choosing to cover immigration. And the language that we use is very problematic, and how we refer to each other is very problematic. And I think that, like, I won't name names because I'll get in trouble, but I think just for lack of a better word, policing and ensuring that we are using the right language when we talk about the border and we talk about asylum seekers and when we're covering this, it's going to be extremely important because one of my fears already, and I'm seeing it, is that in some networks and some reporters and some people in power won't do that correctly. And so I think the more we can do in terms of holding each other accountable when it comes to that, and the better.
No, thank you. That,
Yeah.
again, being from the Rio Grande Valley, that's something that resonates with me. It's
Yeah.
definitely something that comes up a lot in coffee shops or weekends with my family. Always kind of have to monitor how things are being described.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but thank you,
But thank
Mark.
you for those questions. Yeah.
No, of course. Thank you for everyone for the questions. They're great, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. But Mark, I'll hand it over back to you.
Juan Pablo, did you, oh yeah. Paula, thank you.
No,
Uh,
thank you, Mark. Thank
I
you.
got I got this book for Christmas, and I got this book in the summer, and I
Not a light
gobbled them
read.
up.
Why do you do that? Don't do
Oh,
that to
because
yourself.
you gotta know what you gotta know what's you gotta know what you're facing. And
No.
for us being able to go for Green Latinos and our members, it's being able to grow, to
Mhm.
constantly be dynamic, to
Mhm.
know what who people we're trying to serve, the people we're trying to how to the communication we need. Um, I'm encouraged that you're out in the field doing the work you're doing with integrity, with honesty, that you're reaching the people you're reaching, that you're facing some people who you'd rather not be in front of, but you're doing that hard work. It's brave and it's real, and we commend you. I'm gonna tell you that I won the cage match fight to be able to interview you amongst our staff. And so it's been an honor.
No, thank you.
I hope we get to work more with you.
Absolutely.
Know that our issue and our community is not going away, that we will and are the leaders in
No, no.
fighting for the future of our comunidad, our existential future with the climate crisis. And we appreciate the work that you do. And
No, thank you to
one,
all of you.
one
Really.
Juan's going to tell you more about how to join us, and then we'll give you your last word.
Yes. Thank you all for joining us today, and especially for the thoughtful engagement and the critical conversation. The questions, again, they were all amazing questions. Sorry that we could not get to them. But as we're facing these challenges, especially in the moment, from climate crisis to disinformation targeting our communities, one thing is clear: we cannot tackle these issues alone, and we must stand together in comunidad to create a better, healthier, and more just future. So this is why I urge each and every one of you to join Green Latinos. Again, Green Latinos is a vibrant and growing network of environmental and climate justice leaders. Membership is super easy, flexible, and open to individuals and organizations alike. So by becoming a member, you'll gain access to resources, opportunities to collaborate, and a platform to amplify your voice in the fight for environmental liberation. So if you go onto our website, it takes less than 5 minutes to sign up. Together, we are stronger, and your membership will continue to help us through this vital work, both at the federal and local levels. Just want to say thank you again, and we look forward to welcoming you into our community.
I'll just say very, very quickly, once again, thank you. Thank you to all of you for taking the time to join. And more than anything, thank you for what you do. And I reiterate the importance of having green Latinos in this landscape, and the work is incredibly important. So again, thank you for the opportunity. And fortunately, unfortunately, I'm sure we will be having many of these conversations. So please always use me as a resource, and we'll always try our best, no, to work together. But thank you.
Gracias. Bienvenidos.
You.
Muchas gracias a
Thank
todos.
you. Bye.
Adiós.
Gracias. Adiós.